one
Your Royal
silent
Highness,
signal.
I cannot allow it.
One
But this is
intended
important.
recipient.
Let me pass. My
Why
orders
it was
are final,
sent
sir.
only to Prince William.
My
In the
fellow
digital
citizens, the
age
time
where
for
every
action
royal
is
move
now.
is scrutinized,
We must unite
photographed,
and face this
analyzed
challenge
by
together.
millions, how does one send a message
I, William, do
that
solemnly
only
swear to
one
uphold the
person
duties
will
of my
understand?
office, faithfully
On a
and to the
seemingly
best of my
ordinary
ability.
Tuesday morning in March 2024, Prince William received a signal so subtle, so carefully crafted, that not even his closest advisors noticed it. Yet this silent communication would change the course of royal history and reveal a truth that had been hidden for over 2 decades. The sender? Someone who knew that only William would recognize the significance of a single white rose placed in a very specific location, at a very specific time, carrying a message that would shake the foundations of everything he thought he knew about his family's past. The morning mist hung heavy over the grounds of Kensington Palace as Prince William made his usual early walk through the gardens. It was March 15, 2024, a date that would later be marked in his private diary with a simple asterisk, though no one else would ever understand its significance. The path he took was the same one he had walked countless times before, a route that had become as natural to him as breathing, past the ornamental lake, around the sunken garden, and toward the memorial dedicated to his mother, Princess Diana. But on this particular morning, something was different. Something so small that most people would have dismissed it as coincidence or the work of an overeager gardener. There, placed precisely at the base of the memorial statue, lay a single white rose. Not the usual arrangement of flowers that mourners and admirers left daily, but one perfect bloom, its stem cut to exactly 7 inches, placed at an angle that faced directly toward the palace windows. William stopped walking. His breath caught in his throat as memories flooded back. Memories of a conversation he had with his mother just days before her death in 1997. A conversation about secrets, about signals, and about a promise she had made to someone who had risked everything to protect her during the darkest days of her marriage. The white rose wasn't random. The 7-inch stem wasn't a coincidence. The precise placement wasn't the work of a casual mourner. Someone who knew about that long-ago conversation was trying to tell him something. Someone who had waited 27 years to break their silence. Prince William looked around the gardens, his trained eyes scanning for anything unusual, anyone who might be watching. The security cameras would have recorded everyone who entered the area in the past 24 hours, but somehow he knew this investigation wouldn't be that simple. Whoever had left this rose knew exactly how to move through royal security undetected. They understood the palace routines, the blind spots, the precise timing needed to leave a message without being caught. As he bent to pick up the rose, William noticed something else. Tucked beneath the stem, almost invisible to the naked eye, was a small piece of paper. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded it, revealing 7 words written in handwriting he recognized but hadn't seen in decades. The truth about Charles. Thursday, as usual place. The letter M hit him like a physical blow. There was only one person who had ever called herself M in his mother's presence. Only one person who had used that particular combination of cryptic messaging and floral signals to communicate with Diana during the most dangerous period of her life. Margaret Thornfield, his mother's former lady-in-waiting, who had disappeared from royal circles immediately after Diana's death and had never spoken publicly about her time in service. Margaret had been more than just a lady-in-waiting. She had been Diana's confidant, her protector, and, according to palace whispers, the keeper of secrets that could destroy reputations and end careers. When Diana died, Margaret vanished as completely as if she had never existed. No forwarding address, no final interview, no tell-all book deal like so many other former royal employees. She simply disappeared, taking whatever she knew with her. And now, after 27 years of silence, she was ready to talk. But why now? And what truth about Charles was so important that she would risk exposure after decades of successfully hiding from the world's most persistent media? William pocketed the note and the rose, his mind racing through possibilities and implications. Thursday was only 2 days away. The usual place could only mean one location, a small cottage in the Cotswolds where his mother had sometimes retreated during her most difficult periods, where Margaret had arranged clandestine meetings away from palace surveillance and media attention. It was a place Diana had thought was completely secret, though William had discovered it quite by accident when he was 16 and had never told anyone, not even Harry, about finding it. The walk back to the palace felt longer than usual. Every step was weighted with the knowledge that his understanding of his family's history was about to change dramatically. The white rose in his pocket seemed to burn against his leg, a physical reminder that some secrets refused to stay buried forever. By the time he reached his private office, William had made a decision. He would keep this meeting with Margaret secret, even from his wife Catherine. Some conversations needed to happen without witnesses, some truths needed to be heard without the filter of advisors or the complication of family loyalty. Whatever Margaret wanted to tell him about his father, whatever secret she had guarded for nearly 3 decades, he would face it alone. He spent the rest of the day going through the motions of his royal duties, attending meetings, reviewing correspondence, and maintaining the carefully constructed facade that had become second nature to him. But beneath the surface, his mind was consumed with questions and possibilities. What could Charles have done that was so damaging that Margaret had felt compelled to disappear? What truth was worth 27 years of silence, and why was now the right time to break it? The cottage in the Cotswolds had been his mother's sanctuary, a place where she could shed the weight of royal protocol and simply exist as herself. It was there that she had planned her most controversial interviews, there that she had made the difficult decisions that would ultimately lead to her divorce from Charles. And it was there, apparently, that Margaret Thornfield was waiting with information that could change everything William thought he knew about his father and his family's past. As the day wore on, William found himself studying his father differently during their brief interaction at an evening reception. Charles moved through the crowd with his usual grace and charm, shaking hands and making conversation with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his entire life in the public eye. But now William looked for signs of hidden guilt, for traces of whatever secret Margaret was preparing to reveal. He saw nothing unusual, nothing that suggested his father was carrying the weight of some decades-old transgression. Yet the white rose in his pocket suggested otherwise. Margaret's carefully planned signal indicated that she possessed information significant enough to risk her hard-won anonymity. She had spent 27 years in hiding, successfully evading the media's attention and the palace's curiosity. For her to emerge now meant that whatever she knew was too important to take to her grave. The evening hours passed slowly as William wrestled with anticipation and dread. Thursday's meeting would either confirm his worst suspicions about his father or reveal that Margaret's long silence had been motivated by something else entirely. Either way, his world was about to shift in ways he couldn't yet imagine. In his private moments before sleep, William held the white rose and thought about his mother's final weeks. Diana had been different in those last days, more determined but also more frightened than he had ever seen her. She had spoken in riddles about people who couldn't be trusted and secrets that needed to be protected. At the time, he had attributed her paranoia to the stress of her complicated life and the constant media pressure. Now he wondered if she had been trying to prepare him for revelations that would come years later. The rose lay on his bedside table as he finally drifted off to sleep, its white petals catching the moonlight that filtered through his window. In 2 days he would learn why Margaret Thornfield had chosen this moment to break her silence, and what truth about his father was important enough to risk everything for. The silent signal had been received, and there was no turning back from whatever consequences would follow. Thursday couldn't come soon enough, and yet William found himself hoping it would never arrive. Some truths, once revealed, could never be unknown. Some secrets, once spoken, changed everything forever. And some signals, once answered, led down paths from which there was no return. Thursday arrived with unseasonable warmth for mid-March, as if even the weather understood the significance of this day. Prince William had barely slept, spending most of the night staring at the ceiling and trying to prepare himself for whatever Margaret Thornfield was about to reveal. He had told his staff he needed a private day for personal reflection, something that wasn't unusual for him around the anniversary of his mother's death. No one questioned his need for solitude, and certainly no one suspected he was about to meet with a woman who had been hidden from the world for over 2 decades. The drive to the Cotswolds took 2 hours, but William chose to make the journey alone, without his usual security detail. It was a calculated risk, but one that seemed necessary for the complete privacy this meeting would require. The cottage sat at the end of a winding lane, surrounded by overgrown hedgerows and ancient oak trees that provided perfect natural camouflage from curious eyes. As he approached the familiar stone building, William felt the same mixture of comfort and sadness that always accompanied visits to places where his mother's presence still lingered. The cottage looked exactly as it had during Diana's lifetime, as if time had stopped the moment she died. The climbing roses that she had planted still covered the front wall, though they were wild and untamed now. The small garden where she had found peace during her most turbulent years had returned to nature, creating a secret sanctuary that felt completely removed from the formal grandeur of palace life. William parked his car behind the cottage and made his way to the back entrance, following the same path his mother had used when she wanted to enter unseen. The key was still hidden under the 3rd stone from the garden gate, exactly where Diana had always left it. Some traditions, apparently, were too important to change. Inside, the cottage felt like a time capsule. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through unwashed windows, and the air carried the faint scent of lavender and old books. The furniture was exactly as Diana had left it, down to the small writing desk where she had composed some of her most important letters, and the comfortable armchair where she had spent hours reading and thinking about her future. Margaret Thornfield was waiting in the sitting room, and William was struck by how much she had aged since he had last seen her. The elegant woman who had once moved through palace corridors with quiet confidence was now in her 70s, her dark hair silver, and her face marked by years of careful living. But her eyes were the same, intelligent and observant, missing nothing. She rose when he entered, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The weight of 27 years of silence hung between them, along with the shared grief for a woman they had both loved and lost. Margaret had been like a second mother to him during his childhood, always present but never intrusive, always protective but never obvious about it. Her disappearance after Diana's death had been one more loss in a series of devastating changes. "Your Highness," she said finally, her voice carrying the same warmth he remembered from childhood, though it was now tempered by years of caution. "Margaret," he replied, abandoning royal protocol, "I thought I would never see you again." She smiled sadly. "I hoped you wouldn't have to. But circumstances have changed, and there are things you need to know before it's too late." They sat facing each other across the small coffee table where Diana had once served tea to her most trusted friends. Margaret reached into a worn leather briefcase and withdrew a manila envelope, thick with documents and photographs. Her hands shook slightly as she placed it on the table between them. "Your mother made me promise to keep certain secrets until the right time came to reveal them," Margaret began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to disclose. "She believed that someday you would need to know the truth about your father's actions during their marriage, not for revenge, but for understanding, and to protect yourself and your own family from making the same mistakes." William felt his chest tighten. "What kind of mistakes?" Margaret opened the envelope and withdrew a photograph, black and white and clearly taken with a telephoto lens. It showed Charles in conversation with a man William didn't recognize, outside what appeared to be a private clinic. The timestamp indicated it was taken in August 1996, just months before Diana's death. This photograph was taken by a private investigator your mother hired when she began to suspect that Charles was not just having an affair with Camilla, but was actively working to undermine her credibility and her mental health, Margaret explained. "The man with your father is Dr. Richard Hemingway, a psychiatrist who specialized in what we now call gaslighting and psychological manipulation." The words hit William like a physical blow. He had always known his parents' marriage was troubled, had witnessed enough arguments and cold silences to understand that their relationship was far from the fairy tale the public believed it to be. But this suggested something far more sinister than simple incompatibility or adultery. "Are you saying my father was deliberately trying to make my mother believe she was unstable?" William asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret nodded gravely. "The sessions with Dr. Hemingway were documented extensively. Your mother's private investigator managed to obtain recordings of several meetings where Charles discussed strategies for making Diana appear emotionally unstable and potentially unfit to mother future heirs to the throne. She withdrew a small digital recorder from the envelope, its existence anachronistic in the cottage's timeless atmosphere. This contains excerpts from those sessions. Your mother wanted you to hear them when you were old enough to understand the implications, and mature enough to handle the truth responsibly." William stared at the recorder as if it were a dangerous weapon. Part of him wanted to refuse to listen, to maintain the carefully constructed relationship he had built with his father over the years since Diana's death. But another part of him, the part that had always wondered about the gaps in his mother's story, needed to know the truth. "Play it," he said quietly. Margaret pressed the play button, and suddenly Charles's voice filled the cottage, younger but unmistakably his. The sound quality was poor, clearly recorded from a distance, but the words were clear enough. "The key is to make her doubt her own perceptions," Charles was saying. "When she brings up my relationship with Camilla, I need to respond in ways that make her question whether she's seeing things clearly. Suggesting that her jealousy is affecting her judgment, that the stress of royal life is making her paranoid." Another voice, presumably Dr. Kaze. Hemingway responded. "And the children? How do we handle their observations? They're young enough that they can be convinced their mother is going through a difficult phase," Charles replied. "Children adapt to whatever reality they're presented with, especially when it comes from a position of authority." The recording continued for several more minutes, detailing strategies for isolating Diana from her support network, for undermining her confidence in her own judgment, and for creating situations where her emotional responses would appear disproportionate to observers. It was a methodical blueprint for psychological manipulation, delivered in the calm, educated tones that William had grown up respecting and trusting. When the recording ended, the silence in the cottage felt suffocating. William sat staring at his hands, trying to process what he had just heard. His father, the man who would someday be king, had deliberately plotted to destroy his mother's mental health for what appeared to be purely selfish reasons. "There's more," Margaret said gently. The investigator also discovered that Charles was working with certain members of the palace staff to monitor Diana's communications and report back on her activities and emotional state. People she trusted were providing detailed reports on her vulnerabilities and her fears. She withdrew a stack of typewritten reports from the envelope, each one bearing the letterhead of Buckingham Palace. The reports detailed Diana's daily routines, her phone conversations, her meetings with friends, and even her private moments with her children. They read like intelligence briefings on an enemy agent rather than updates on a member of the royal family. "Your mother discovered this surveillance network in early 1997, Margaret continued. She realized that her paranoia wasn't paranoia at all, but an accurate assessment of her situation. She was being monitored, manipulated, and systematically undermined by the very people who were supposed to support and protect her." William looked up from the reports, his face pale. Is this why she was so frightened in those final weeks? She knew what was happening to her? She knew, but she couldn't prove it in any way that would be believed by the public or the media, Margaret confirmed. Who would believe that the Prince of Wales was engaged in a campaign of psychological warfare against his own wife? It sounded like the paranoid fantasies of a woman under enormous stress, which was exactly how Charles and his allies wanted it to sound. The implications of what Margaret was revealing began to sink in. If Diana's fears and suspicions had been based in reality rather than paranoia, then her entire public image as an unstable, jealous wife was a carefully constructed lie. Her emotional outbursts weren't the product of mental illness or inability to handle royal pressure, but rational responses to genuine psychological abuse. "Why are you telling me this now?" William asked. "Why wait 27 years? Margaret's expression grew more serious. "Because your father is about to become king, and I have reason to believe he's beginning to use similar tactics against other members of the royal family. Your mother made me promise to protect you and Harry from the same treatment she endured, but also to ensure that the truth would come out if Charles ever tried to repeat his behavior with others." She reached into the envelope one final time and withdrew a recent photograph, this one clearly taken with a modern digital camera. It showed Charles in conversation with the same Dr. Hemingway, who appeared to have aged considerably but was unmistakably the same man from the 1996 photograph. "This was taken 3 weeks ago," Margaret said quietly. "Hemingway is now in his 80s and officially retired, but he's still consulting privately with your father. And according to my sources, they've been discussing strategies for managing what Charles refers to as family disruptions during the transition to his reign." The photograph felt like ice in William's hands. The idea that his father might be planning to use the same psychological manipulation tactics that had destroyed his mother against other family members was almost too horrifying to contemplate. But the evidence was sitting right in front of him, documented and undeniable. "Who else knows about this?" William asked. "No one living except you and me," Margaret replied. "Your mother's private investigator died in 2003, and I've been the sole keeper of these records ever since. I've spent 27 years waiting for the right moment to fulfill my promise to Diana, and I believe that moment has arrived." William stood and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where his mother had once found peace. The roses she had planted were blooming wild now, their beauty untamed and natural. It seemed fitting that the truth about her marriage would finally come to light in this place where she had been most herself. "What do you want me to do with this information?" he asked, turning back to Margaret. "That's your decision to make," she said. "Your mother trusted you to handle the truth responsibly when the time came. But she also believed that knowledge is power, and that understanding how these manipulation tactics work would help you protect yourself and your family from ever experiencing what she went through." The weight of responsibility settled on William's shoulders like a heavy cloak. He now possessed information that could destroy his father's reputation and potentially destabilize the monarchy itself. But he also had the knowledge needed to recognize and prevent the same patterns of abuse from continuing into the next generation. As the afternoon sun began to fade, William made a decision that would change the course of his relationship with his father forever. Some truths, once known, demanded action. And some promises once made required courage to keep. The drive back to London felt like a journey through a different world. William carried Margaret's envelope on the passenger seat beside him, its contents representing 27 years of hidden truth that now belonged to him alone. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, yet he found himself struggling to reconcile the Charles he had known as a father with the man revealed in those recordings and photographs. How do you process the discovery that someone you've loved and respected your entire life was capable of such calculated cruelty? By the time William reached Kensington Palace, he had made several difficult decisions. First, he would not share this information with Harry, at least not immediately. His brother was still struggling with his own relationship with their father and the royal family in general. Adding this burden to Harry's existing pain seemed unnecessarily cruel, especially since Harry was building a new life away from royal duties. Second, he would not confront Charles directly, not yet. The recordings and documents represented strategic advantage that could be lost through premature revelation. Instead, William decided to begin his own investigation into his father's current activities. If Charles was indeed planning to use similar psychological manipulation tactics against other family members, William needed to identify the potential targets and find ways to protect them. The thought that his own children might someday be subjected to the same treatment that had destroyed his mother was absolutely unacceptable. Catherine was waiting for him when he arrived home, her expression concerned but patient. She had learned over the years of their marriage not to press him immediately when he returned from these private journeys. William appreciated her intuitive understanding of his need for processing time. But tonight felt different. Tonight he was carrying secrets that affected not just his own understanding of his family's past, but potentially threatened their future. "Difficult day?" she asked simply, offering him a cup of tea that he accepted gratefully. "More difficult than I expected," he admitted, settling into the chair across from her in their private sitting room. The normalcy of the domestic scene felt surreal after the revelations of the afternoon. Here was his wife offering tea and quiet companionship, while his mind reeled with evidence of psychological warfare and systematic manipulation. Catherine studied his face with the careful attention she had developed over years of reading his moods and reactions. "Do you want to talk about it, or do you need more time?" William considered the question seriously. Part of him desperately wanted to share the burden of what he had learned, to have Catherine's calm perspective and analytical mind help him process the implications. But another part of him recognized that involving her would also put her at risk, especially if Charles was indeed planning to extend his manipulation tactics to other family members. "I need to think through some things first," he said finally. "But I may need your help soon, particularly in watching for certain behaviors or patterns in family interactions." It was a cryptic response, but Catherine nodded with understanding. She had long ago learned that royal life often involved careful navigation around unstated dangers and unspoken threats. Her own experience with media manipulation and public pressure had taught her to recognize the signs of systematic undermining, though she had no idea how relevant that experience was about to become. The next morning, William began implementing his plan to investigate his father's current activities. Using his position and access, he quietly reviewed recent palace communications and staff assignments, looking for patterns that might indicate renewed surveillance or manipulation efforts. What he discovered was both subtle and disturbing. Dr. Richard Hemingway, despite his official retirement, had been making regular visits to Buckingham Palace under the guise of consulting on family wellness initiatives. The appointments were always scheduled during times when other senior royals were occupied with official duties, ensuring privacy for whatever conversations were taking place. More troubling still, several staff members who had been part of Diana's surveillance network in the 90s had recently been promoted to positions with access to other family members. William's investigation revealed that Charles's interest in managing family disruptions wasn't theoretical. There was evidence of increased monitoring of several family members, including detailed reports on their daily activities, personal relationships, and private conversations. The targets appeared to be anyone who might pose a potential challenge to Charles's authority as the new king, or whose behavior might reflect negatively on the monarchy's stability. Most concerning of all, William discovered that he and Catherine were among those being monitored. Reports detailed their conversations with friends, their children's behavior at school, and even Catherine's private discussions with her family. The surveillance was comprehensive and invasive, conducted by people they trusted and interacted with daily. The realization that his own family was under the same type of surveillance that had tormented his mother was infuriating and frightening. William began to understand the paranoia Diana had described in her final weeks, the feeling of being constantly watched and judged by people who were supposed to be allies. Every conversation now had to be evaluated for potential misinterpretation, every emotion carefully controlled to avoid providing ammunition for those who might use it against him. But knowledge of the surveillance also provided William with a strategic advantage. He could now identify the specific staff members involved in the monitoring network and begin feeding them carefully crafted information designed to mislead Charles about his true activities and intentions. If his father wanted to play psychological warfare, William was prepared to engage on those terms. The first test came during a family dinner at Buckingham Palace the following week. William had prepared carefully, knowing that his behavior would be observed and analyzed for any signs that he suspected the truth about his father's activities. He needed to appear normal and unsuspecting while actually gathering intelligence about Charles's current mindset and future plans. Charles was in an unusually good mood that evening, holding court at the head of the table with stories about his recent official engagements and plans for upcoming state visits. William watched his father carefully, looking for signs of the calculated manipulator revealed in Margaret's recordings. What he saw was more unsettling than obvious villainy would have been. Charles appeared genuinely warm and paternal, asking about William's children with apparent sincere interest and offering advice about balancing royal duties with family responsibilities. There was no obvious malice or calculation in his manner, no hint that he was simultaneously orchestrating surveillance of his son's private life. The disconnect between the caring father at the dinner table and the cold strategist on the recordings was deeply disturbing. During dessert, Charles made a casual comment that sent chills down William's spine. "I've been thinking about the importance of family unity as we transition into my reign," he said, his tone conversational. "It's crucial that we all present a coordinated front, that any potential disruptions or disagreements are managed internally before they can affect public confidence in the monarchy." The words were innocent enough on the surface, but William now understood the subtext. Charles was signaling his intention to actively manage and control family members' behavior using whatever methods he deemed necessary. The psychological manipulation tactics weren't a thing of the past. They were being refined and prepared for broader application. After dinner, William lingered in his father's study, ostensibly to discuss an upcoming joint engagement. In reality, he wanted to observe Charles's personal workspace and look for any additional evidence of the manipulation campaign. What he found exceeded his worst expectations. On Charles's desk, partially concealed beneath other papers, was a handwritten list of family members with brief notations beside each name. William managed to read enough to understand that it was a priority ranking for intervention strategies, with his own name near the top of the list. The notations included psychological assessments and recommendations for specific approaches to modify behavior patterns. The clinical coldness of reducing his family members to psychological profiles and manipulation targets was perhaps the most chilling aspect of his father's planning. These weren't the actions of someone who had made mistakes in the past and learned from them. They were the calculated moves of someone who had refined his methods and was preparing to use them more extensively. William excused himself from the palace that evening with a growing sense of urgency. The evidence was now overwhelming that Charles was not only planning to repeat the psychological warfare that had destroyed Diana, but intended to expand it to include multiple family members. The question was no longer whether to act on Margaret's revelations, but how to act effectively to protect his family and prevent further victims. Over the next few days, William developed a comprehensive strategy for confronting his father's manipulation campaign. He couldn't simply expose the evidence publicly without potentially destroying the monarchy itself, but he also couldn't allow the psychological abuse to continue unchecked. The solution would require careful timing, strategic allies, and the courage to risk everything for the sake of protecting others from experiencing what his mother had endured. The plan would begin with a private confrontation with Charles, using the recordings and documents as leverage to demand an immediate end to the surveillance and manipulation efforts. William would make it clear that he possessed not only evidence of past crimes, but documentation of current activities, creating a deterrent effect that should protect other family members from becoming targets. But William also knew that Charles's response to being confronted would reveal whether his father was capable of change or whether more drastic measures would be necessary. Some people, when exposed, chose to modify their behavior and seek redemption. Others doubled down on their harmful actions and escalated their efforts to maintain control. As he prepared for what would likely be the most difficult conversation of his life, William reflected on his mother's courage in her final years. Diana had known she was fighting a battle she couldn't win publicly, but she had continued to gather evidence and seek truth anyway. Her legacy wasn't just the charitable work and public compassion she was remembered for. It was also the proof she had left behind that the truth would eventually emerge and justice would eventually be possible. The white rose that had started this journey still sat on William's desk, its petals now dried and fragile, but its significance undiminished. It represented Margaret's courage in breaking decades of silence, Diana's foresight in preserving evidence for the future, and William's responsibility to ensure that the truth would finally lead to meaningful change. The confrontation with Charles would happen within the week. William had arranged for a private meeting under the guise of discussing his expanded role in royal duties as his father's reign began. It would be the perfect opportunity to reveal what he knew and demand immediate changes to protect other family members from psychological manipulation. But William also understood that this confrontation would fundamentally alter his relationship with his father forever. Some conversations change everything, and some truths, once spoken, cannot be taken back. He was prepared for that reality, because some principles are worth any personal cost to uphold. The next phase of this decades-long story was about to begin, and William was ready to honor both his mother's memory and his own family's future by finally bringing the truth into the light. The meeting was scheduled for Tuesday afternoon at Clarence House, in Charles's private study, where they could speak without interruption. William had chosen the location carefully. It was a room where his father felt most comfortable and secure, which might make him more likely to be honest when confronted with the evidence. It was also a space filled with personal photographs and mementos that would serve as stark reminders of family bonds that had been violated by deception and manipulation. William arrived precisely on time, carrying a briefcase that contained copies of all the documents and recordings Margaret had given him, along with the new evidence he had gathered about current surveillance activities. He had spent hours rehearsing this conversation, trying to anticipate his father's possible reactions and prepare responses that would be both firm and strategic. This wasn't just a family confrontation, it was a negotiation that could determine the future safety of multiple people. Charles was waiting behind his mahogany desk, reviewing correspondence with his reading glasses perched on his nose. He looked up with a warm smile when William entered, the same expression of paternal affection that had made the evidence of his manipulative behavior so difficult to accept. "William, good to see you," Charles said, rising to greet his son with a brief embrace. "I'm looking forward to discussing your expanded responsibilities. There's so much we need to coordinate as the transition moves forward." William accepted the embrace, noting how normal and genuine his father's warmth felt. This was the most unsettling aspect of the entire situation. Charles's ability to compartmentalize his manipulative behaviors from his apparently sincere family affections. It suggested a level of psychological sophistication that made him even more dangerous than William had initially realized. "Actually, Father, I need to discuss something else with you first," William said, settling into the chair across from the desk. "Something that affects all of our family relationships and the integrity of the monarchy itself." Charles's expression shifted slightly, the warmth replaced by the careful neutrality he adopted when sensing potential conflict. It was a subtle change, but William now recognized it as a calculated response designed to maintain psychological advantage during difficult conversations. "That sounds quite serious," Charles said, returning to his seat behind the desk. "What's troubling you?" William opened his briefcase and withdrew the manila envelope, placing it on the desk between them. The physical presence of the evidence seemed to change the entire atmosphere of the room, introducing a tension that hadn't existed moments before. "I've recently come into possession of information about your activities during your marriage to my mother," William began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. "Information that documents a systematic campaign of psychological manipulation designed to undermine her credibility and mental health." For a moment, Charles's expression didn't change at all, as if he hadn't quite processed what William had said. Then his face went through a series of micro-expressions: surprise, calculation, and finally a kind of resigned wariness that suggested he had always known this moment might come. "I see," Charles said quietly. "And where did this information come from?" "Margaret Thornfield," William replied, watching his father's reaction carefully. "She's been keeping these records for 27 years, waiting for the right time to fulfill a promise she made to my mother." The mention of Margaret's name caused a visible physical reaction from Charles. His shoulders tensed, and his hands briefly clenched before he regained control. It was clear that he remembered exactly who Margaret was and what she might have witnessed during her time as Diana's lady-in-waiting. "Margaret always was overly dramatic about the difficulties Diana and I were experiencing," Charles said, his tone carefully measured. "The stress of our marital problems affected everyone around us, sometimes causing people to misinterpret normal conflicts as something more sinister." William had expected this response. It was exactly the type of gaslighting technique documented in the psychological manipulation playbook. Deny the reality of the evidence by suggesting that the witnesses were unreliable or emotionally compromised. These aren't misinterpretations, William said firmly, withdrawing the digital recorder from the envelope. These are recordings of your conversations with Dr. Papa, Richard Hemingway, discussing specific strategies for making my mother doubt her own perceptions and undermining her emotional stability. The sight of the recorder caused Charles's carefully maintained composure to crack. His face went pale and his breathing became more shallow, physical signs of stress that he couldn't quite control. "I'd like you to listen to one of these recordings," William continued, "so there's no confusion about what we're discussing." He pressed play, and once again Charles's younger voice filled the room, discussing the best methods for psychological manipulation with clinical detachment. But this time, hearing the recordings in his father's presence added a surreal quality to the experience. The man sitting across from him was listening to his own voice describing strategies for destroying his wife's mental health, and William could see the complex emotions playing across his face. When the recording ended, Charles sat in silence for several minutes. William waited, understanding that this was a crucial moment that would determine the direction of their entire relationship going forward. His father's response would reveal whether Charles was capable of acknowledging the harm he had caused and making meaningful changes, or whether he would continue to deny and deflect responsibility. "That was a long time ago," Charles finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Diana and I were both under enormous pressure. We were both making mistakes and saying things we didn't mean." "This wasn't a mistake or something said in anger," William replied. "These were calculated strategies developed over months with professional consultation. And according to my recent investigation, you're currently using similar tactics against other family members." He withdrew the photographs of Charles's recent meetings with Dr. Hemingway and the surveillance reports he had discovered. Charles's face grew ashen as he recognized the evidence of his current activities. "You're monitoring my communications, Catherine's private conversations, even our children's behavior at school," William continued. "The same surveillance network that tortured my mother is now being used against your grandchildren." The mention of the children seemed to hit Charles like a physical blow. Whatever justifications he might offer for his treatment of adult family members, applying psychological manipulation tactics to young children crossed a line that even he seemed to recognize as unacceptable. "The children were never meant to be directly involved," Charles said weakly. "The monitoring was just to ensure their well-being and protect them from potentially destabilizing influences. The same justification you used for monitoring my mother," William pointed out. "And we both know how that ended. She spent her final years believing she was going insane, not understanding that her paranoia was actually an accurate assessment of her situation." Charles stood abruptly and walked to the window, his back to William, as he struggled to maintain control. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion that might have been genuine remorse or might have been self-pity. "You have to understand the pressure I was under," he said. "The media scrutiny, the public criticism of our marriage, the constant questions about my fitness to be king. Diana's emotional instability was affecting everything: public confidence in the monarchy, diplomatic relationships, even parliamentary support for the institution itself." "So you decided to make her emotional instability worse rather than address the real problems in your marriage?" William asked. "You chose to deliberately damage her mental health rather than seek honest counseling or consider that she might have legitimate grievances." Charles turned back from the window and William was shocked to see tears in his father's eyes. For a moment, the psychological manipulator revealed in the recordings was replaced by what appeared to be genuine human anguish. "I never intended for it to go as far as it did," Charles said. "The strategies Dr. Hemingway recommended seemed reasonable at first, ways to help Diana manage her emotions and respond more appropriately to royal pressures. But over time, it became something else entirely. It became systematic abuse," William said bluntly. "And now you're implementing the same system against other family members. How far are you planning to let it go this time?" The direct confrontation seemed to break through Charles's remaining defenses. He returned to his chair and buried his face in his hands, the weight of decades of deception and manipulation finally catching up with him. "I don't know how to stop it," he admitted. "The monitoring, the strategic management of family relationships, it's become so embedded in how the palace operates that I'm not sure anyone remembers how to function without it. And with the transition to my reign, the pressure to maintain control and prevent disruptions has become overwhelming." William felt a mixture of anger and pity for his father. The admission suggested that Charles had become trapped by his own manipulation systems, unable to distinguish between legitimate security concerns and pathological need for control. But it also revealed a level of self-awareness that offered hope for meaningful change. "The surveillance ends immediately," William said firmly. All monitoring of family members' private communications stops today. Dr. Hemingway's consulting relationship with the palace is terminated permanently. And any staff members involved in the surveillance network are transferred to positions where they have no access to family information. Charles looked up from his hands, his face haggard but alert. And if I agree to these conditions, what happens to the evidence you've gathered? Do you plan to release this information publicly? It was the question William had been expecting, and he had prepared his answer carefully. The evidence was powerful enough to destroy Charles's reputation and potentially destabilize the monarchy, but using it that way would also harm innocent people and create chaos that served no one's interests. The evidence remains private as long as the abuse stops completely and permanently, William said. But if I discover any future attempts to manipulate or monitor family members, or if anyone else becomes a target of psychological manipulation, everything becomes public immediately. The terms were clear and non-negotiable. Charles could choose to end his manipulation campaign and maintain his secret, or he could continue his harmful behavior and face public exposure of everything he had done. The choice would reveal whether he was motivated primarily by genuine care for his family or by the need to maintain power and control. Charles sat quietly for several minutes, weighing his options and their consequences. Finally, he looked directly at William with an expression that seemed to combine genuine remorse with resignation to necessary change. I agree to your conditions, he said quietly. The surveillance ends today, and I'll personally ensure that Dr. Don returns compact. Hemingway has no further contact with anyone in the royal household. William felt a moment of relief, but he also understood that this was just the beginning of a long process. Trust, once broken as completely as it had been between them, would take years to rebuild if it could be rebuilt at all. And William would need to remain vigilant to ensure that his father kept his promises and didn't simply develop more sophisticated methods of control and manipulation. There's one more thing, William said, withdrawing a final document from his briefcase. I want a formal, written statement acknowledging what you did to my mother and apologizing for the harm you caused. Not for public release, but for the historical record and for my own peace of mind. The request clearly surprised Charles, but after everything that had been revealed, he was hardly in a position to refuse. He spent the next hour writing and revising a statement that acknowledged his use of psychological manipulation tactics against Diana and expressed genuine remorse for the damage those actions had caused to her mental health and their family relationships. As William prepared to leave, carrying the signed statement and his father's promise to end the surveillance operations, he felt a complex mixture of emotions. He had achieved his primary goal of protecting other family members from psychological manipulation, but the cost had been the complete transformation of his relationship with his father. Trust might eventually be rebuilt, but innocence could never be restored. The white rose that had started this journey had led to exactly what Margaret had promised: the truth about Charles's actions and the power to prevent their repetition. But, like all truths that emerge from darkness, this one carried both liberation and burden, both justice and consequence. The confrontation was over, but the real work of healing and rebuilding was just beginning. 6 months had passed since the confrontation at Clarence House, and William found himself living in a world that looked the same on the surface but felt fundamentally different underneath. The surveillance had ended exactly as Charles had promised, confirmed by William's own discreet monitoring of palace communications and staff activities. Dr. Hemingway had disappeared from royal circles as completely as if he had never existed, and the network of staff members who had been involved in family monitoring had been quietly reassigned to positions with no access to sensitive information. Yet the knowledge of what his father had been capable of and what his mother had endured colored every interaction William had with the royal establishment. He found himself analyzing conversations for hidden meanings, watching for signs of manipulation, and constantly evaluating whether the people around him could be trusted with genuine honesty. It was, he realized, a mild version of the paranoia that had consumed Diana in her final years, and understanding its rational basis made it no less exhausting to live with. Catherine had noticed the changes in him, though she respected his need to process whatever he had learned during those private meetings and investigations. Their relationship had actually grown stronger as William became more protective of their family's privacy and more intentional about creating genuine intimacy away from royal obligations. The knowledge that their previous communications had been monitored made every unobserved conversation feel precious and authentic. The children, thankfully, seemed unaffected by the broader family tensions. William had made sure of that by implementing new security protocols that protected them from any form of surveillance or psychological manipulation. Their innocence was something he was determined to preserve for as long as possible, understanding now how his own childhood had been shaped by manipulation tactics he hadn't recognized at the time. Margaret Thornfield had returned to her quiet retirement, satisfied that her promise to Diana had been fulfilled and that the truth had finally emerged. William had met with her once more to confirm that Charles's surveillance operations had indeed ended, and she had seemed genuinely relieved to finally lay down the burden of secrets she had carried for so many years. Her courage in breaking decades of silence had changed everything, though few people would ever know the full extent of her contribution to protecting the royal family from continued abuse. The relationship between William and Charles had evolved into something complex and carefully managed. They maintained their public duties and family obligations with professional competence, but the easy warmth that had once characterized their interactions was gone forever. Charles seemed genuinely committed to honoring his promises to end the manipulation and surveillance, but William remained vigilant for any signs that old patterns might be returning. During their private conversations, Charles had shown moments of what appeared to be genuine remorse for his treatment of Diana. He spoke sometimes about the pressure and isolation that had led him to make such destructive choices, and William could see that his father was struggling with the knowledge of how much harm he had caused. But apologies, however sincere, couldn't undo decades of damage or restore the trust that had been systematically destroyed through deliberate deception. The written statement Charles had provided, acknowledging his psychological manipulation of Diana, remained in William's private safe, along with all the other evidence Margaret had preserved. It served as both historical record and insurance policy, ensuring that the truth would never again be lost or denied. William understood that this documentation might someday become public, perhaps after Charles's death, when the full history of the royal family's internal struggles could be examined without causing immediate political upheaval. Harry remained unaware of the specific details of what William had discovered, though he seemed to sense that something significant had shifted in the family dynamics. During their occasional conversations, Harry mentioned that Charles appeared different somehow, less controlling, more respectful of boundaries, and notably less interested in monitoring or managing his adult children's personal choices. William had simply acknowledged that people change over time, without revealing the dramatic intervention that had forced those changes. The broader royal household had adapted to the new protocols with remarkable efficiency. Staff members who had been involved in family surveillance found themselves in different roles, often with increased responsibilities and better compensation that discouraged questions about their reassignments. The palace's official explanation for the changes emphasized improved efficiency and modernization of security practices, which was true enough in its own way. Public perception of the royal family continued unchanged, unaware of the internal revolution that had taken place. Charles's reign proceeded smoothly, with none of the family disruptions that his manipulation tactics had supposedly been designed to prevent. If anything, the elimination of surveillance and psychological control had improved family relationships and reduced the stress that had previously created the very problems Charles had been trying to manage. William found himself thinking often about the lessons embedded in this experience. The most disturbing revelation wasn't just that his father had been capable of such systematic cruelty, but that the behavior had been able to continue for so long without being challenged or exposed. It suggested broader institutional problems with how the royal family operated, and how power was exercised and accountability was enforced within those systems. The experience had also deepened William's understanding of his mother's legacy, and the courage she had shown during her most difficult periods. Diana hadn't been the unstable, paranoid figure that public perception had sometimes portrayed. She had been a woman fighting against deliberate psychological manipulation while trying to protect her children and maintain her sanity. Her emotional responses hadn't been inappropriate reactions to normal marital stress. They had been rational responses to systematic abuse. This realization had profound implications for how William thought about his future role as king. He was determined to ensure that the monarchy he would eventually lead would be based on genuine collaboration and mutual respect rather than manipulation and control. The psychological tactics that had been used against Diana could never again be employed against any member of the royal family, and the surveillance networks that had enabled such abuse would never be rebuilt. William had also become more conscious of his own potential for abuse of power. Understanding how his father had gradually escalated from reasonable security concerns to systematic psychological manipulation served as a constant reminder of how easily good intentions could become corrupted by the isolation and pressure of royal life. He made a commitment to regular self-examination and to maintaining relationships with people who could honestly challenge his decisions and behavior. The white rose that had started this journey still sat in William's private study, now pressed between the pages of a book his mother had given him years before her death. It served as a daily reminder of how secrets could be kept for decades but truth would eventually find a way to emerge. It also reminded him of Margaret's courage in finally speaking after 27 years of silence, and of the responsibility he now carried to ensure that such silence would never again be necessary. As autumn arrived and the royal family prepared for the busy season of state events and public engagements, William reflected on how much had changed since that March morning when he had discovered a single flower placed deliberately in his path. The silent signal had accomplished exactly what it was intended to do. It had delivered crucial information to the only person who could act on it effectively, and it had ultimately led to meaningful change that protected vulnerable family members from continued harm. The story could have ended differently. Charles could have refused to acknowledge his actions or agreed to William's demands, only to later find more sophisticated ways to continue his manipulation tactics. The surveillance could have been temporarily halted but then quietly resumed when William's attention was focused elsewhere. The institutional culture that had enabled psychological abuse could have simply adapted to new methods rather than genuinely reforming. But instead, the confrontation had led to real change because it had been conducted with strategic intelligence rather than emotional outrage. William had recognized that destroying his father publicly would also damage innocent people and destabilize institutions that served important purposes. By focusing on ending the harmful behavior rather than punishing past actions, he had achieved meaningful protection for family members while maintaining the stability necessary for the monarchy to continue functioning effectively. The experience had also taught William about the complex relationship between justice and practicality in situations involving institutional power. Perfect justice would have required public acknowledgement of Charles's actions and consequences that matched the severity of the harm he had caused. But practical justice had focused on preventing future harm and ensuring that victims were protected, even if complete accountability remained private rather than public. Looking ahead, William understood that his vigilance could never completely relax. Trust, once broken as thoroughly as it had been, could only be rebuilt through consistent demonstration of changed behavior over many years. Charles's commitment to ending his manipulation tactics would need to be proven repeatedly through his actions rather than accepted based solely on his promises. But for now, 6 months of evidence suggested that the confrontation had indeed led to meaningful reform. The surveillance had ended, the psychological manipulation had stopped, and family members were living with a level of privacy and autonomy that had been missing for decades. It wasn't perfect healing, but it was genuine progress toward relationships based on respect rather than control. The silent signal that Margaret had sent through a single white rose had ultimately accomplished something that years of Diana's direct confrontations and emotional appeals had been unable to achieve. Sometimes, William realized, the most powerful communications are those that arrive at exactly the right moment, carried by someone with the courage to break long silence, and received by someone with both the power and the wisdom to act effectively on difficult truths. As he prepared to fulfill his own destiny as future king, William carried with him the knowledge that truth, however long delayed, could still emerge and lead to meaningful change. The responsibility now was to ensure that this particular truth would continue to guide his family toward greater honesty, accountability, and genuine care for one another's well-being. The white rose had delivered its message, the truth had been revealed and acted upon, and the future, while still uncertain, was now built on a foundation of honesty rather than deception.